European, being in the position of power, had one yardstick. He didn't use anybody else's yardstick. His yardstick was the yardstick. But what has happened, and most Europeans don't realize it, time has changed.
With this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer, to struggle, to sacrifice, and even to die if necessary in order to be free.
And as the people in Africa and Asia get some power of their own, they get a mind of their own. The European yardstick now isn't necessarily the yardstick.
The Negro came to feel that he was somebody.
Race had emerged as the touchstone of the post-war world. By the 1950s, colonial rule had produced an elite of African nationalist intellectuals, and behind them, large, urbanized and literate working classes. Together, they witnessed the power of nationalism. In Egypt, where Gamal Abdel Nasser expelled the British, and in Algeria, where the resistance stood firm in its war of liberation from France. At the same time, the presence of the United Nations, the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States, and the nascent anti-apartheid movement focused the lens of world scrutiny on black rights and spurred on colonized Africans in their call for self-sovereignty.
I'm happy to state that in accordance with your wishes, arrangements are now in progress to turn Ghana into a republic.
Ghana is free.
In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan state to be granted independence by transfer of power to Kwame Nkrumah, widely considered the father of African nationalism.
He was impressed by the United States. He was a student here. The Americans did something extraordinary. He said, the 13 colonies, instead of each one becoming independent, they came together, created a union. Power is in the union. That is what Nkrumah explained the American dream and the American realization and so on. So he dreamed for something like that in Africa.
Nkrumah had inspired others with his vision of a United States of Africa. Men like Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. Men who had received colonial education. With the idea of empire increasingly unpalatable to the voting public, European governments had little choice but to work with the nationalists.
There was an indifference at this stage towards the empire, towards the colonies, and I found that really rather depressing. You know, you'd try and talk about it in a pub and people would say, oh, shut up, have another drink or something. There was just this idea that that colonialism is wrong and needs to be got rid of.
The pressure for wholesale decolonization had been building ever since the end of the Second World War. The tipping point came on Wednesday the 3rd of February 1960.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact.
British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a warning shot to the whites of apartheid South Africa and a death blow to the colonial venture across the continent.
That signaled, to my mind, the idea that Britain disapproved and the world disapproved of apartheid and the racism of apartheid. But it didn't necessarily mean that we were giving up on our role in Africa. I didn't think so.
In fact, within 10 months of the Wind of Change speech, Britain had surrendered 2 key African territories, France 14. The rate of decolonization when it arrived was breathtaking. Many were freed without bloodshed. 1960 was hailed the Year of Africa, and hurried withdrawals of the colonial powers continued into the next 3 decades.
The transfer of power need not indicate that the Europeans suddenly realize that, well, it's time to give independence to the natives of Africa and Asia. No. It is in view of the possibility of large-scale war throughout sub-Saharan Africa that the French understood that it was better to prepare to negotiate with the nationalists, and hence you have the liberation movement.
Will you go back to the Congo one day?
No, never.
Do you think that it's finished for the Europeans in the Congo?
Yes, I think so.
But no sooner had African nations escaped the shackles of colonialism than a new battle for the continent was underway: the Cold War. Back when the colonial idea had Europe's politicians spellbound, the communists had opposed it. And throughout their years of struggle, African nationalists had found a powerful friend in the Soviet Union.
These two great powers, America and Russia, begin to carve up the world between them. Independence coincided with the Cold War, where it mattered whose side the president was in terms of this global struggle between Russia and America. And they both tried to organize coups to get their people in, and this was very destabilizing.
The Congo's Patrice Lumumba was a hardline nationalist, labeled a communist by America. His game of Russian roulette appeared to have paid off when in 1960 he oversaw the handover of sovereignty from Belgium.
He was to become victim of the opposition between the West and the East, between the bloc, Soviet bloc and the Americans.
Because militia leaders with control of the mineral-rich Katanga province refused to be swallowed up in a wider republic led by a Soviet-backed Lumumba. Fearing their own material losses, the US and Belgium supported the rebels. And just 3 weeks after bringing the country into independence, Lumumba was captured by the Katanga militiamen, tortured and killed.
So he became a legendary figure, not for what he did, but for what he could represent.
Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech, which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier.
Congo's riches, combined with global geopolitics, had again proven a disastrous mix. And with freedom from overt colonial exploitation, the scramble for resources was driven underground. For a fleeting moment, the Lumumba affair raised the questions of what in Africa would replace the strong arm of colonial rule, and whether national unity was achievable with hostilities bubbling beneath the surface. But in the excitement of independence, this was quickly forgotten.
I suppose one of the ironies is that the European countries that were democratic didn't really introduce much democracy to Africa. So when independence comes and people can vote, many of these countries then politically exploded. All sorts of political problems that had been suppressed by colonial imperial rule then burst out, and many of them, like in Congo, practically tore the countries to pieces.
I think it was a very unplanned thing